Matt and I have a big task to do today. We're going to try to develop some characters for a potential detective series. And I think this is going to be very fun. Matt, you wrote me an email, and I'm just going to read you part of your email back to you so that you can explain to me what you meant, because you always use such interesting language. And you said, let us write or speak on the engine required to develop and produce a 100 episode show, which is an industry standard. I know that's a standard because then you get royalties once it goes into resyndication, right? In this episode of the Meaning Code, we can incorporate the parabolic as a mode, an artistic decision generally, and the fact that Jesus let his gospel story include all those people he met. Those asking for breadcrumbs from the table were given eternal life. Okay, so first of all, what do you mean when you say the parabolic as a mode? And how is that an artistic decision?
I'll admit, when I wrote that sentence, I was operating synesthetically on how the word mode made me feel as I was speaking it on my tongue and then writing it and seeing it. And when I say mode, I'm thinking modality. And for me, that associates with, albeit cryptically, with shamanism and with music and with culinary arts. And so basically all the senses in which we bring in the world, either by tasting really good and finely prepared food, or we're seeing something beautiful, or we're hearing something beautiful. These are modalities of focusing attention on certain aspects of nature. And when you combine those in a movie or television series, you are then allowed to make decisions about how they are juxtaposed and arranged. And they can be unconscious or conscious, and they're both, but the degree to which, or the depth to which you want to make it unconscious is your decision. So an artistic decision generally.
So when you say make it invisible, you mean that's why you use the parabolic?
Yeah,
So in other words, within the parabolic story, there is a hidden underlying level. Is that what you're saying?
Multiple. And in the same way that, so when I was in college, I wrote an essay where I was talking about one of the pre-Socratic philosophers named Anaximenes. Anyway, he was the one who created the infinite as a category as we know it today. He called it the apeiron. So P-E-R-I-O-N. It just means the all and around. We don't really know what it means, but it's around, it's a preposition. He put in front of it a, so not around. He destroyed the position. And he wanted to say that's everything in the all. And it allows for stretching and even breaking without loss. I tried to tell my professor what that did to me, reading that fragment of a word play. And I did it in the guise of, here's an essay about a writer, and here's some secondary sources about what they thought about him. But he was so confused with my language that he asked me into his office, and he sat me down and he said, I've been looking at this thing for 5 hours today, and I don't know what you're doing.
I can identify with that.
But I love the last paragraph. And then he did one of these things and he says, what does it mean? And I told him I was at Taco John's, and I thought about it all night, and then I just freewheeled it from my heart. And he said, oh, apparently that meant more to him than my silence. And he said, now I have the skeleton key. He found what he needed in order to make some sense of some document. I don't know what I did. I don't think I really did anything to catalyst for that. In the same way, the parabolic, as far as I can tell, allows you to say so much with so little that whatever the other person's going to get out of it is entirely feasible. So for example, the other day I was in my car and I heard 94.5 talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and they gave an interpretation of it. And I thought, that's important for a screenplay I might write someday. That parable has a structure in it full of conflict and wit. Then I talked to somebody the next day and I said a few things, and I knew immediately, oh, now we've just wrangled in what that parable means in my relation to this person and this person's relation to another person, a third person that I've never met. Now, those aren't true in a scientific, I've looked at it in the microscope and I've weighed it and I've physically touched it, but the parable is such that it allows those things to fit in them and be seen in its book ending, so that I can now just say something with the full confidence of it will strike a chord, even though I've never met the other person. And it looks like magic, but it's the using of a tool. So I think the parabolic, in some form that I haven't yet put my finger on, is a tool for evoking from people a body of knowledge that has to be spoken, articulated in order for them to get to the next stage of where they are going in their thinking and in their interpersonal relationships. Like it lubricates somehow the engine that allows us to be bold with one another in interpersonal relationships and talk about things that have to be talked about. Otherwise, they will remain unconscious and the clock will tick and 5 years will pass before more intimacy is gained or necessary arguments are made. So I kind of think it's helpful for communication, the parable, in that way. What do you think?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, what you're saying is opening up a lot of keys for me. It is the key in the lock. I mean, the parable is the key in the lock that allows translation between people in terms of communication, because we're communicating with each other at a much deeper level. And the story comes in and then it opens up and it starts, when it opens up inside of us, it connects into a lot of other key and lock issues inside of us. And so it's unlocking all of these things all simultaneously, which is I mean, it's very much a very genius data compression, right? And I was thinking about this, I was thinking about this in reference to our typical cast of characters with detectives. And I have to go and put a little background on this. I've been reading The Master and His Emissary again by Ian McGilchrist, and especially rereading the part where he goes through the history of thought and of art and philosophy. Mainly because I always felt like my education in those things is a little bit lacking. And so to be able to read his broad scope that he goes through is so great. There's one quote that he makes on page 302, where he's talking about when the right hemisphere begins to take some power again during the Renaissance and in the time just after the Renaissance. He's talking about a writer named Villon. And he says, in Villon's work too, we start to see imperfections and failings, not as deplorable lapses from some ideal, but as both what makes us individual and at the same time binds us together. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about it's our transparency about our imperfections, or the way we communicate our imperfections and flaws, that bind us together as people and help us to produce community. And how difficult it is to be in community with someone who is the ideal, someone who manages to meet all the standards. It's very difficult to be in authentic community with them because even though we admire them and we want to copy their example, we feel judged because of our inability to do so, right? But if that person is suffering, we can find true fellowship with them because we suffer together. We can understand their suffering at the level of the fact that suffering is a universal. And now I'm thinking about this in terms of detectives. On the one hand, you have Sherlock Holmes, brilliant, so well educated. He knows everything. He sees everything. Very difficult to communicate with on that level, because on that level, he's a judge. All the people around him fall short all the time. You see this relationship between him and Watson, and Watson's always falling short. Compare that to Monk, who is badly handicapped. He's emotionally handicapped. He's physically not very strong. But his suffering is a known quantity. And so at that level, the people around him want to interact with him and help him. And so in order to make Sherlock a character that people want to interact with, he had to have some failings, some lapses, right? So he's got the cocaine problem. He's got the backstory with the woman that he was, what's her name? Edith? No. Well, whoever the woman was that he loved, and in some stories she got killed, in some stories she didn't, whatever. He has this tragic backstory. That is there to connect our hearts to his heart so that we care about him. Otherwise, why would we care about him? He's too perfect, right? So I think this whole thing about the parable brings us into the story in places that we can understand, where we are either the sufferer on the side of the road, or we recognize ourselves in our own inability to care for those who are suffering, if we're the one who crosses the road and goes to the other side, or we recognize ourselves in our struggles to be the person who is willing to reach out and help, and all the difficulties that entails. We connect with those people at the level of our own inadequacies.
I think key also so I agree with that. Suffering as the baseline, suffering as it's the accent that accents every moment in a language that hits us, but also the accent outside of language, so that even if you do it visually, or you break up a bunch of zeros and ones into groups and space them out so it looks like something, you'll eventually see a face. It's an accenting, has an accenting function. And there's something about a ventriloquism in that, because when you see someone touch some hot piece of iron, immediately we almost imitate them. If it's working correctly, we're like, ooh. And it's not quite identification intellectually, but it's something, it's almost as if something within has just been activated. So it has that call and response. I know there's a book out there on art about call and response. That is very important in storytelling, and the parable tends to do that, because the parable, like you said, it's algebraic. It has the person on the road, which calls out to us to respond with the most necessary associations for that person on the road: beggar, wayward, running from something. It's a call and response. Now, the art of the parable is then, what do you do next? With that loaded association matrix, what do you add that will subtract certain associations so that they don't make sense anymore in this wider frame, and embolden and strengthen others in a new way, especially if it's a good one, it's a new way. So that wayward becomes not a negative value, but a positive, for instance. That's where parables really shine, when they change the common emotional, intellectual value placed on associations. So the priest wasn't supposed to be radically insufficient for that person wounded on the side of the road on his way to Jericho, but he was, which immediately brought to mind, from the audience, I can understand that the priest has failed me locally, but then the next part, a Samaritan walks by and scandalous. It's it's a word in our ears, but the visual emotional complex contradicted by their good deed was probably so overwhelming to the original audience. And so it has that binding, like you said, for quick and easy communication quality, but it also can have, in its most exalted forms, the ability to engage and change minds. I think that's part of the reason why Jesus, for example, and many artists make manifestos. Conversion comes with a changed mind, and that's usually a second order effect from changing your sensibilities.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the other reasons that, and this is probably so obvious, but any kind of wisdom, if you try to relate it to another person, any kind of wisdom that you've learned, if you try to relate it to another person in an aphorism, instantly it sounds like a cliche. They're going to go, duh, everybody knows that. But that's because the thing that you learned at so much deeper level, and you can't really articulate it in just a phrase, but a parable will teach that deeper lesson through that story in a way that gives it multiple levels of meaning, so it doesn't come across sounding like just a cliche, even though it's an old story and it's a very simple story. Even the story of Cain and Abel, how many, 7 lines or something, very, very simple story. But because of the way that the story is told, and it has all these levels, the wisdom becomes tacit knowledge to you and to the other listeners without it sounding like a cliche. So people are willing to receive it and think about it.
I think one of the things that separates cliche and gold is whispered, cliche is shouted. So I want to do a visual representation of that dichotomy. Some of the most emotionally packed moments in my viewing of entertainment or in moments with people has been inside a Russian doll setup of structures. So for instance, I'm working on a spec script for a show called Roswell, New Mexico. Spec just means you try to mimic the voice of the showrunner who gives the tone for the writers to set up their conflict. So the tone of the Good Samaritan in the 21st century, you have to decide what that is. And then once you decided the tone, what are some anecdotes that will give shape to that tone's expression? And then you go to the nitty gritty of making the dialogue serve that vision. But now we have to, in order for that moment of whisper to have its chills, you have to take what you just made and give it a home. It's not the home. It's just a bunch of more or less cliche, naked and exposed. But what I mean by home is, if I can take that and put it in a pre-existing ritual schema that people are already accustomed to having intellectual and emotional experiences within, then there's the possibility for new within that structure of known and sane. So Peterson says, go out into the unknown, but what if you could bring the unknown into the center of the known, sneak it in? That's really good storytelling. So you take, with Roswell, New Mexico, everybody knows what Roswell is indirectly. It's a place where the aliens are or aren't. And everybody's got an opinion on that. So it's a known map, it's map territory. Now, what if we take that map territory and put in there PTSD or blackouts or cognitive dissonance, other taboo subjects? Now we've taken those things that on their own, it's kind of too hot to handle. But in this home, it's interesting. Mm-hmm. And takes us by surprise and whispered, values whispered. And I think that's part of the reason that individual people inside that nested structure feel as if those things are actually talking to them and not to the world at large. They have a personal relationship, but it's a highly mediated one down to the keyhole of, I like aliens, I love aliens. That's why I'm interested in the Roswell propaganda.
Mhm.
Okay, within that, I like romance. So this is a romance in the Roswell universe. I like that. Okay, so within the romance, it's a man and a man. Ooh, that's kind of, I don't know about that. But I'll go into it because I already buy these other three things. So right in between them, it's not, they could be heterosexual or homosexual. The point of this encounter is one person has PTSD. Oh, and the other person has this other thing that slightly matches, and that's what's drawing them. And they're talking about things they couldn't talk to about anyone else in the world, and so much more than that. And then you begin to go into the unspeakable, which is right where that whisper occurs. But it needs that home of those other layers out, like a keyhole in a keyhole in a keyhole. And that's a lot of like architecture work.
That's really interesting because this is a completely different frame, but it's the idea of what can happen, where the potential is in alien environments. And I can look at this from two sides. When I lived in Japan, I was the alien, right? I was the outsider, the one that was different. I mean, we were different. My daughter was kind of blonde, and so people would come up to her on the street and touch her hair. It's a little strange, because she stood out, because she was the alien. But the fact that we were the alien gave us opportunities to talk to people about things that they never would have talked about otherwise. They were willing to listen to us talk about Christ because we were outsiders, we were different, and we come in with this exotic thing to talk about, and it was interesting. That's what made it interesting. Then when I was teaching at the university in Iowa, my students were all aliens. They were all people from other countries who came to the United States to study. And so because they were in an alien environment in the American university setting, they were much more open to talking about issues of life that they would have felt uncomfortable talking about in their own home environment. But now they're in this alien environment, and it makes people hungry for communication, hungry for fellowship. So I think you're really onto something, that if you can weave an alien kind of environment, whether you're talking about sci-fi or detective stories or any other kind of drama, inside that alien environment, it opens opportunities to talk about much richer, more complex issues.
We all know what it means to die, either directly or indirectly. If we know it directly, we're not around anymore to tell the story. But uncle has died, siblings are suffering and about to die, whatever it may be. And that's part of the pull. So the widest keyhole of a detective setup. You're introduced to the body of the victim rather immediately. All right. This is a framing technique. This is the perimeter of the known and unknown structure. So that gives you okay, I know what's going on. There's a plausibility structure here. To then zoom into the goal, which is to hear a value whispered. But before you get there, it's the detective. Okay, he's kind of on the outskirts. He has a hamartia, he has a pride, a wound that gives us knowledge he is unaware about. So like with Monk, he doesn't know the depths to which his OCD cripples him because he's in it. But we know because we're outside of it, looking at him. And his friends know, but they only know from their perspective. We know more than they know, and what they know combined with what he doesn't know, because we're the audience. So it's a brilliant setup to see something no one else sees, and that gives us a feeling of we owe something now to the show. It's kind of magical. And then with the Sherlock Holmes, his hamartia, the cocaine, the past woman, these things allow us to have knowledge over and above the great deducer himself. And that humanizes him because it makes us God to him, which oddly enough gives us a set of obligations to him as a creature. We can despise him, judge him, look away from him, or see what he does. It's so many unspoken things. And this is one of the reasons why viewership is a active thing. It's never passive. So many decisions are made before we even think we're making a decision in viewing stories.
By the way, I just remembered her name was Irene.
Thank you.
Yes, Irene. Yeah, so in terms of if we're going to create a setup for a detective, we need the detective, we need the sidekick, we need the competent but not brilliant police authority, whoever that might be. You need to decide, is it always going to be a murder, or are there sometimes going to be mysteries that are not murders? Or, I mean, I think what has happened in recent decades is that the plots have become so predictable that I think it's important to find a way to pull back and make the plots less predictable. Because the predictable plot is they have an idea, they zone in on one person, that's the wrong person. So they zone in on another person, that's the wrong. So they might go through 4 people before they get to the right guy. And you know that that's the pattern. So you almost could tune out until the end of the show, right? But I think one of the things that's important is that I was reading some material and I don't think I wrote it down for myself. Oh, yes, I did. This is some stuff about, hold on a second, this is good. It's from Aristotle's 3 Unities. And it says the component events ought to be so firmly compacted. He's talking about tragedy here, but I think this is also true of anything that you write. The component events ought to be so firmly compacted that if any one of them is shifted to another place or removed, the whole is loosened up or dislocated. For an element whose addition or subtraction makes no perceptible extra difference is not really a part of the whole. It's the old story of if you see a gun in Act 1, it better be used someplace before the end of Act 3, or you've misled your audience. And I think in a lot of times in mysteries, if they have a lot of red herrings in there, the viewers feel betrayed. Put it that way. So if there's going to be something that looks like a red herring, it better at least lead the detective to something that is more meaningful. You have to be able to see the reason for everything that's in the script. There shouldn't be any loose ends sticking around, I guess. Because if there are, that the viewers feel betrayed. It's like, you misled me. That was a trick. I don't like tricks.
And so we're in this hypothetical room breaking this story. We're doing a number of things at once. 2 of the things we're trying to do is ask ourselves, how can we make the conclusion satisfying, which is another way of saying, how do we supply the feeling that all the parts leading up to this end note give us a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, but isn't one in spite of them. It's because of all of this. And I knew it was going to come together, but I didn't know it would come together quite this way so well. That was a good use of my time. Yeah. Maybe, and then the implication is maybe my life could be like that. Maybe a life could be like that. And why not my life? So there's at least those 3 levels of effect from a well-made thing. In this case, a story. But the second problem we're solving is what to do with time. Right? These are 30-minute, hour-long events, and you have to deal with time in such a way that you don't run into the problem of one thing after the other, so that you think, well, why can't I just pop in for the first 5 minutes and then pop out and come back for the last 5 minutes? You have to, and time isn't a straight line. Time has those valleys, and some minutes feel longer depending on the action. And so not every action can be the same, and you have to build so you feel like you're going somewhere without losing the thread. And that's where the right images come into play, because a well-chosen image will actually trigger a previous image. So if in 30 minutes in you trigger something from the first 15, you've done well. And you can't control the entire world, but there are reliable cues. But then you have to go above that, so you don't just look like a workhorse that can get it done, because the viewer will see through that. They'll just say, oh, you're painting by numbers. You're just you're saving the cat here, and you're catching the criminal there, and then you have some nice philosophical musing at the end. Boring. Not boring because in and of themselves they're boring, but like you said, they were predictable. So you have to at least do that, and then you have to transcend it. And I think that comes from a deep love of the material, because in the detective genre, we do have to have red herrings and misdirection. That's what the audience loves. They love being stooped by the author, because it challenges them to think even more deeply and critically after the event. And it's like learning to box with a good boxer. So we have to do it, but we have to be aware that our audiences, they know the misdirections are coming. So we can't placate them or treat them like children. We have to do it, but also twist it so that we make a commentary upon it. And they know we're doing that without speaking down to them. So it's very much a relationship, and we got to feel it out while holding true to those core principles.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, you're right. Red herrings are important, I guess. Well, so one of the things that I really dislike about a lot of modern television and movies is that they use every opportunity to make political statements, and they just sort of jam it in there. It's not organic. It doesn't fit. And as a result, everything is becoming weighted over to one side to the extent that there's no actual fulcrum anymore. There's no balance between ways of thinking or thoughts or approaches to a problem. And so I was thinking how interesting it would be if a person, I'm not the person because I'm not a writer, but I was thinking how interesting it would be if a person could come up with a scheme where part of the driving essence of the set of characters, the cast of characters that make up this little community, is that maybe the detective is a person who thinks very differently than everybody else. And part of every episode is how they learn to talk to each other in spite of this big difference in their outlooks. So one example that I thought of was, what if the detective is a fan of Stoic philosophy? And so when he sees a clue or he sees the problem, and he'll make a little pithy statement that comes out of his Stoic philosophy. I just wrote down a few as example. This one is from the Moral Sayings of Publius Sirius. Rivers are easiest to cross at their source. It's a little parabolic story, but it says a lot of things. And it could be used as the kind of thing of, they have to try to figure out what he means when he says that, because what he means when he says that is actually the solution to the crime. That somehow, I haven't worked that out, but somehow that idea is going to be the fulcrum of that story. But it also means that they look with suspicion at him because, as a Stoic, he holds up certain ideals of what it means to be strong and brave and courageous and, all those things. And so maybe they feel a little bit judged by him, or they feel like they can't communicate with him, or they feel like he's not politically correct or something. But then on the other side, they have to learn to appreciate what he has to say, but he has to also learn to hear them, because otherwise he can't get his job done, right? So it's that kind of interplay that I thought might be interesting, that would show people it is actually possible to have communication about difficult topics between people, be a model of that within the story, without it being a cliche or a political statement. You know what I'm saying?
I am. So let's play with it. Let's see all the things we can do with it. So one thing that came to my mind And I'm going to take my time with this and sink my teeth into it because I really like what you laid out here. The fulcrum, I'm going to start with that because the fulcrum seems to be a controlling idea. I think we can get a lot of mileage out of it for these characters and for this premise. So what that's because it's three things. And anytime we have three things, we have more than enough, which is a good place to be. Two things, you have conflict, polarity, evil, good. But you don't have anywhere to go with it except a gunfight in a snowy field between two people walking away from one another and counting to 10. That's the most you've got is a shootout scene. But when you have three things, you have eternity. So the three things of the fulcrum is what I just said about tension, the one end negative, the other end positive. But you have this interesting third thing, which is the bottom part of it that balances it or doesn't. And you can put it in the middle, you can put it far to the right, you can put it far to the left. You could even put it on top of wheels so you can move it. That's interesting because that's infinite. You could do that all day, every day for the rest of our life, for the rest of the show's life cycle. In fact, that's part of what pragmatically can define the life cycle of the show. We're starting to find our, as Archimedes said, give me a pole, give me a fulcrum, and I can move the world. I just need to know where to put it. So we found our Archimedean point here in principle. And that's important because we got to stretch this thing out for 100 episodes. So it's, when you're with your example,
we need this to work episode by episode, but it also needs to work for the whole arc of the entire 100 episodes.
Exactly. And the way to write one episode is to know the whole season first. And in order to get that kind of mileage, you need an overriding idea. So that's why I'm stressing this fulcrum. I think it's, even if we drop everything, it's important to see where the fulcrum fits in. It allows us to do things with time and space. So for instance, today we're talking about the detective and where he's going. What is he going to do? He's a staple in the show. He shows up in every show. But maybe in 5 months, when or in 5 days, when we're working on the 5th episode, which will air 4 weeks from the initial, we have to ask ourselves, okay, how has the character changed, but also still remain who he is, as the audience knows from week 1, week 2, week 3, because you have to have both. We can't just say, well, he's changed because it's week 4. We have to have a little more sophisticated idea of what we're tracking. So we could ask ourselves, where's the fulcrum this week? Get there. And how does it make sense to be here after 3 weeks? And now we're not even talking about the characters, but we have this way in which everybody in the room can say, yep, that's where the fulcrum is this week. And you're already put in a mentality. You're already given a keyhole framing structure to now begin to swim inside of. Okay, if it's here this week, that opens up some possibilities that weren't open to us when the fulcrum was in the other direction last week.
So,
okay.
So when you say that, are you indicating that, let's say this week the fulcrum, I'm trying to make sure I understand what you mean by the fulcrum. Let's say this week the fulcrum is over towards the supporting cast of characters, meaning that they're the ones that have found some element of truth this week, and so we need to help them communicate in such a way that their element of the truth comes forward in this story and shows their character growth in this way or that, rather than it being over on the other side with the detective this week. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
That's a totally valid way to use the fulcrum. So we're discovering that indeed you can make it all up. We don't have to be tied even to the detective genre. What we just discovered with the fulcrum is a way of generating story and tracking story abstractly without ever being married to the darlings or to ideas within the plot. We have a way of tracking, okay, is it with the cast or is it with the one detective? That's one way of talking about the fulcrum. Another one would be with respect to the detective, where's his heart? Is he thinking about the past, or is he hopeful for the future? Where is it? It's never one or the other, but where in the gradient? And then how do we understand that gradient? We can ask that question forever, because it's not about, is he good or bad, period, but it's where, with the fulcrum as a metaphor. And so it's true, we can do it of one of the many, we can do it of every single character, and we do it of the main character. And in doing this, we would have to do it for all three of those levels. And that's why it takes so long to invent this stuff, is we have to answer all those questions. And then once we've answered that, we pin it to the wall, we devote our waking consciousness to it once we've agreed upon it, and then we can write the story. Because the story then becomes the nice package of all that. It's like math. Like Michael sent me a link this morning about category theory, abstract mathematics. And this is very much cutting edge mathematics nowadays, where they want to talk about all the ways in which things, mathematical objects, for instance, can be the same. It doesn't mean they're equal, but equivalent. And so this fulcrum is like a higher order category with infinite elements to show how they can be equivalent given some thing we share back and forth. So for example, when you brought up that Stoic saying of the source, that could be something we can use to exfoliate where that fulcrum is for a particular emotional payoff. But until we know we're working with the fulcrum and that we want the emotional payoff, we don't really know yet what to do with that elegant saying of yours, other than everything, because it's an elegant saying. But once we have our thing we want to achieve, then we can use a saying like that intentionally. And that's what they do. And that's what we're doing. But it's taking this time for us to breathe it out and ask these questions so that and we haven't done it yet. The most basic question, what do we want to whisper into the heart of a devoted viewer to this show? Because I don't like to say, what message do we have, but what do we want to whisper in the heart? And then it has to be something, can't be everything. And once we have that, then we'll be able to see, what all these other Russian doll structures, fulcrum, why is it even a detective? We can start to see how that stacks up to allow us to whisper this value, whisper this thing. And I don't yet know what our whispered thing is. And
well, let's pick one.
yeah.
What do you think?
Our conversation will
think
show
of-
us
what
what
do
we
you think
tend
of hope?
towards.
Is hope something that you could make your whisper?
I don't know. I'm torn, because I think yes, but also I think it has to be concrete, but it's somewhere between the concrete and the abstract hope. The way we would go about it perhaps is, when you say hope, what is that doing for you that makes you lean into it? And then do you have like a story for it? Do you have a personal experience, like a vulnerability with it, or just a curiosity for it? Tell me more.
Well, I've had several conversations with Michael about what the scripture is really talking about when it talks about hope, because it looks like hope is actually talking about how good things are concretized. That faith posits a future, and hope fills it out.
Mm.
Or wait, do I have that opposite? Hope. Okay. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. Okay. Hope posits a future. Faith fills it out. Faith is the substance. So hope is springing forth a kind of a matrix, kind of a skeleton. If this happened, this would be a good thing. But the only way it can become that good thing is with faith. So faith is the substance of this thing hoped for. So out into the future goes this skeleton that needs to have form attached to it. And faith is what brings it the form. So So maybe the long character arc is that this character has some substantial dream for his future, someplace that he'll be on the other side of where he's at now. In Monk's case, it started out to be revenge for the death of his wife. That was the thing that he hoped for, that he worked towards all the time. So that was a continuing theme through all of the seasons. Can he find the six-fingered man, and can he kill him? And most of the time he's a nice, mild-mannered guy, but whenever he thought about that six-fingered man, he was vengeful and terrible. Okay. In the end, though, this is a spoiler for those who haven't seen all 8 seasons of Monk. At the end, what happens is it's not revenge for the death of his wife, but it's he discovers that his wife had actually had a baby before they got married, and that daughter then is still alive, and that is the hope. That is the hope realized, because that is a future relationship of loving care for him, someone that he can serve and someone that he can care for the rest of his life. So it starts out as one kind of a hope, but it turns to another one, and that's the long character arc, right? So if your detective could have some broken part or some character flaw that he himself can see needs to be changed or different out into the future, and then that changes over time as he's moving towards it, that kind of thing.
So yeah, and if we had 8 hours, I would want to make us both miserable until we discovered it, because there's so much we have to break apart from what you said to find what we're really going after. But we're doing it. We're further along than we were 5 minutes ago. So you threw out the rope. Now I'm going to grab it and move us forward with it, just as you moved me forward when you brought up the skeleton of hope. I never thought about that. So I'm seeing the fulcrum. And one way we could talk about it, though I don't think we should end talking about it this way, but this might help us figure out what we're doing next with these layers, is on the right side of the fulcrum, the future side, we have a skeleton. This is where the hope is. And it doesn't have to be good or bad, but it's a disembodied structure. It's something you can put pithily. And it has marrow. And you can beat someone over the head with it like any good bone. Clobber people and call them boneheads if they don't get it. It's just obvious. That's the utopia. So we start to stack what we see when we see the skeleton on the right. Now, if we had someone recording what we're doing, those ways of understanding the structure of the skeleton, you can beat someone over the head with the bone, you can be afraid of the future and run away from it. That could be 2 different characters in the minor cast that literally are acting out those ways of seeing the skeleton in the future. Now we have many fulcrums under the subset of the major fulcrum that we can chart character X and Y. And when we answer our question week by week, where's the fulcrum? We also have to ask the question, where's the fulcrum for he and she? And there should be a logic to where we put each, like dials in music engineering. All right, so we're becoming sophisticated based on what you said. On the other side of the fulcrum, we have to have the antithesis, because that's how the logic of the fulcrum works, to find balance. So it can't be a skeleton, it has to be a beautiful, skinned, tonally accurate human being. Only problem is they're on the left-hand side, far away from the future. And if they stay there, they'll eventually end up like the skeleton, having accomplished nothing. And so faith allows one to walk towards him, then towards the future, so that he can replace himself with the skeleton that will switch places with him at the beginning. And the skeleton structure of the future becomes the skeleton structure of the past. And that, of course, we know the past lives with some people. So everything I said about the future skeleton, you can take the bones off and beat other people over the head with it. You can do with the past skeleton. So we can have this situation where, as one character uses faith, which is going to be the operational word we use for taking a step, which will allow us to decide what actions they're going to take in this episode and what that means for them. That's how we'll define conflict. We know what it means in part. They're moving towards the skeleton. What is that costing them? Well, we refer to the subset fulcrum. Are they afraid of it? Do they want it for power? Are they curious? We flesh that out. Okay, with that said, what is the best kind of anecdote? Does anybody have a good story about being afraid of ghosts or something underneath the closet, something colorful? Okay, yep, that'll work. Insert that. Part of our show has these really philosophical sayings. Well, what would match up with this particular character moving towards the skeleton? Yep. And then we do that. And then as we're moving towards it, remember the skeleton's moving back to replace him at the beginning. What does that simultaneously do? Does he become more brash towards his friends that he was comfortable with back there because he needed them? But as he's moving out towards the skeleton, he's a little harsher with them, almost hitting them with cold objects like skeletal bones. And when you see that, you're like, wow, it's a complex character. But in that fulcrum, we're using what you said about ways to define the end, and then we're seeing how it could play. None of this has a timestamp on it yet, but we're seeing how we could slowly get intervals out of that, maybe.
As you're talking, what I'm hearing is the elements and principles of design. Because the 8 principles of design are unity, harmony, contrast, dominance, repetition, variation, gradation, and balance. What you've been talking about for the last 5 minutes is repetition, variation, gradation, and balance, and how important those are to the structure of the story, right? You also need unity. You need unity of the whole 100 episodes. It needs to be a unified character and narrative arc in that 100 episodes. Each episode has to be coherent within itself, has to be complete. Some part of it has to be complete within each episode. You need harmony, that this whole narrative arc fits together, and then the characters have a harmony as well, okay? You need to have contrast, conflict, which is obvious, otherwise you don't have any forward movement.
Precisely.
Right? And dominance. Now this is that's the one that we haven't talked about yet, but there has to be dominance. And you have to decide, and maybe this could be something that the fulcrum could do. One side of dominance is to say, this is what's in control because this is what has the power. The other side of dominance is to say, this is what fills the room and creates a platform or a backstory for that which is important. So that which fills the room and creates this substructure that allows the focal point to shine, that's the other side of dominance. And that's the side of dominance that I think is Christ, because he architected the universe so that this whole huge panoply of beauty and glory for his creatures, his creation, the focal point of the universe. So that is not the dominance of power, but you could have the fulcrum moving between those two kinds of dominance to be able to let the audience decide for themselves. Do I like the dominance of servanthood and sacrifice, or do I like the dominance of power?
That's amazing. So like you said, so one of the ways in which we develop a sense of the space and scope of the show is to answer the question of what do we mean by contrast? And you alluded to that with the use of power or weakness. That's a great contrast, and it's amenable to the fulcrum structure. And what's nice about it too is as the skeleton gets worked back, as the hero embodied flesh goes forward, the contrast of weakness and strength doesn't have to follow weakness on the right, strength on the left. Weakness goes back to the left, strength goes to the right. There's no natural relation between something being skeletal and being weak, or being fleshed and being strong. We can play with those, just so long as we have the logic of they never are confused one with the other. That sort of discipline of keeping them contrasted allows us to then flip the script of expectations in some other domain. So our dominance, let's see. You could take that one of the principles, stay close to it, and use that in an interesting way with another principle of the 8 that you had mentioned, without ever poisoning either one's well. But because you put them together here instead of there, it looks different and tastes different and is experienced as different. I love that we're still in the abstract realm because we're seeing what's possible. And we're also finding our limit. I mean, I don't think I can think beyond the principles of design. I think they're so abstract to be all inclusive. And we're developing a paralanguage by which we could constantly refer to as we're working out more concrete story problems of, is his name Rex? One name, we haven't figured out enough yet, but one name in principle would make more sense than the other, even if we don't choose either. Why? Because one name is closer in principle to our design answers because of whether Rex has this association or Luther has that other association. One sounds weaker than the other, even though that's subjective, and we'd have to figure out what we mean by weak in that case. But in principle, it can be answered, and it can be answered definitively, given our assumptions.
So because of the sound thing, I missed the 2 names, Rex and
Luther.
Yeah, that's an interesting contrast. Unfortunately, Luther has already been used in the Superman franchise, so.
And Oedipus Rex for the Greek tragedy. They've both been used. And Luther, like you said, I would agree with you that we shouldn't use Luther because it has a lot of fuzziness on it, attracted from the Reformation, other shows, the Superman. And Rex, I mean, I wouldn't want Rex just because it does sound like an animal. And with a detective, we want to balance that cerebral disembodiedness. And we'd have to figure out what we mean by that. But
I mean, doesn't Rex mean king?
Does it? I'm not quite sure of its history.
I'm not either, but when you said it, the name that came to my mind immediately that I think also means the same thing is Regis.
Oh,
As in,
I think
like,
you're right.
Regis Philbin.
Yeah.
Regis is a little bit of an oddity of a name. So, I mean, maybe that would be just an odd enough of a name to. Obviously, we're not going to be able to work this all out in an hour and a half.
Oh, no. But like, I think
has this at least given you some ideas of how to approach, or some new insights on how to approach your writing class?
Because yeah,
you've mentioned that you're taking a writing class. What does that look like? How does that work in principle to be with this group of writers in this writing class?
It's hierarchical, which surprised me. So I thought it was going to be, now I didn't actually think what I'm about to say, but I want to characterize it for the contrast. I thought it was going to be kumbaya, we share our stories around the campfire and smile at the end. Now, I didn't actually think that, but what I mean by those words is I thought it was going to be each person comes out of their silo for about 30 minutes, share the work that they found in the depths of their soul, and immediately win applause because that's the deepest thing they could think of. But it wasn't. Instead, it was, I don't want your ideas. No, none of you. First thing we have to settle is who's in charge. Whoa, what do you mean by that? We don't actually know what we mean by that yet. We need to all see what it means for this room. What? Follow me here. So one person is going to be the head of the pyramid because of, given external reason, they have more experience in a particular industry because they're actually there. That makes sense. That's plausible. So when you give a subjective opinion on someone else's siloed material, it's going to have weight because of that experience and plausibility frame that none of us happen to have. You either buy that and trust that or you don't. It's totally your choice. If you don't, then you won't be in the hierarchical structure and you won't actually be participating in the room. You think, I thought I would have been, but I'm just making noise to their ears. Because every single word coming out of anyone's mouth is being mediated by that structure I just pointed out.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, we wouldn't be able to gauge efficiency and whether or not we're actually coming to something that's going to be written down. We wouldn't know any other way. Okay, so with that hierarchical structure in place, then it becomes, what are we doing here? Like, why does any of this matter? And we haven't even gotten beyond that point yet, because we have to answer the question of tone. What's our heart's tone? And some people don't even get beyond that step because there's no textbook answer to it. And maybe some people spend their entire lives re-asking the question. But eventually, and I think I'm almost there, you look up to your teacher, you buy their plausibility structure, you try to live in it, apprentice in it, listen to what they're saying. Don't just saying, but listen to it. Like I'm treating my teacher like a sage. I believe that not any word that they're using is wasted. I think it's parabolic, and it is. They're saying something that 10 of us hear, but I'm trying to hear in the only way that Matthew Allison could, because that's the gold being whispered to me. And only if I hear that or convince myself that I've heard it, will I make a difference in the class. I'm not competing with anyone. I'm competing with my own inhibition to give myself fully to this thing larger than me that will teach me something. And so you can generalize this to learning in any situation, but and I found something in what she said, what the teacher said, that was just for me. And I'm acting upon it in my own way of writing. And it's showing me a few more things that I could only have heard if I had believed the teacher at this particular place. And so it's leading me on this little breadcrumb path that will, in a month, produce a script. In principle, I could have only written if I would have trusted her at her word in the beginning without deviation. Mm-hmm. Now that's a faith walk. And I don't even want to share the details of it, because the more if I were to talk about it, it would become aired out and it would lose its compressive laser beam concentration. And it would almost become too plausible. It has to be, it feels like myself and the teacher that the teacher's not even in on. And that's the best place, I think, to be as a student, where you know you're carrying a secret, and the only way to tell the secret is to produce the work.
The actions betray the values.
So it's a good class.
So I have two pieces of curiosity, and I'll say them both so that you know what's coming. The first is, how on earth can you determine your tone before you know what it is that you're going to be writing? I just can't fathom that. Well, maybe I can. If I springboard it into art, maybe I can. Because when you're getting ready to paint a painting, you're going to be much more successful if you decide before you start what your mood is. Because the mood can be realized through your choice of color and medium and value, contrast, and all of that. That can be, you can materialize your mood through those things. But if you don't know what your mood is when you start, you're going to be all over the map and you're not going to have a focus. Okay, so maybe that's what they mean when they say tone. The second thing that I was wondering about is, well, this is more of a anecdote. I had the privilege to take workshops from probably a dozen over the years, a dozen really quality artists, many of whom are quite famous. And with each of them, I learned something from each of them that I put into practice during that workshop and created some work of which I'm very proud. The only problem is that's 12 different pieces of work, all of which represent 12 different viewpoints of 12 different people. And I learned something from each of them, but none of them were just me. They were me filtered through that other person's teaching. So at some point, you have to take those things that you learned from those various people and integrate it to the place where you can just work on your own without that outside influence, so that your work really looks like you, right? And I'm sure that's the same thing with writing.
I
Because
wonder though, I think there's a little paradox there. So one analogy might be there's going to church and then there's praying. And I think this partakes of what you described. When you go to church, you see how the priest moves, you see how other people hold their hand out for mass, you hear a chorus, and you're taught something in the homily. Now, if I was alone in my bedroom talking to God, I might things in my own way, but I don't have that thing in between myself and that group, which is that space for the whisper to come through.
yeah,
And so I think something I'm trying to do is I want to always be mediated by this thing above me, not everything. I don't want to go from studio to studio to studio. Ideally, I would like land on one studio and then just become so small and insignificant in and of myself within it that every single interaction within that rich studio would take from me, but be connected to me, so that I didn't know where I began and it ended, and vice versa. So with that teacher saying something and me having to find myself in it, and then producing the work based on this trail that I think I'm seeing, the teacher knows nothing about, and then presenting it not to the teacher, but to someone that is in the same universe as this teacher, for me is a reliable method to be optimally complex and unguessable, but while remaining true to my own way of seeing things, which I ultimately cannot put down on paper how I see something. So it's almost like that idea of you can't see your eye because the eye is what you see all things with. I don't actually know my own tone. And so I want to believe in this person's words that make me think I have a tone, and never get out of that space, because then the actions I take, as you said, will betray the true tone I have that I would never access any other way.
well, you have a tone, Matthew.
Oh, thanks.
You definitely have a tone. And I've had people say this about my artwork too, because when I look at my artwork, I see stuff that's kind of all over the map. I mean, really a lot of variety of style and everything else, because it's hard for me to rein myself in creatively. I'm always like, well, what would happen if I put the paint on this way? Or, well, what would happen if I used more water? Or what would happen if I used a longer handle on the brush? And all of those choices make the work look radically different in some ways. But in other ways, when people look at my work, they say, oh, Karen, you have a style. I do. I can't see the style. All I see is a lot of different things, but they see something in it that they relate to me. And in the same way, I mean, you're the same way. You speak on many different levels, and you articulate yourself in some instances very poetically, so poetically that it's almost opaque to the listener. But then when you begin to articulate what it is that you're thinking of, it kind of opens up these worlds inside of you. And so you have a very unique way of communicating that is definitely your tone. I can totally resonate with that instructor of yours who wanted you to elaborate on that last paragraph, on where that came from, because I often feel that. I read something that you wrote and I think, I know there's some deep, beautiful truth embedded in that, but it's beyond my capacity to understand it because I don't inhabit your world. I don't have your reading background or your educational background or your thought life, all of that. So I can't enter into that until I talk to you about it. And then when I talk to you about it, it like opens up this, I don't know, opens up the throne room sort of.
What
You
you and I
definitely have
just,
tone.
what you just said made me think of what we don't see when we watch. So you mentioned Monk. we see the end product. We see the decision made generally. But behind that were people like you and me, opening up, having these epiphanies, sharing in a room, a real room, like family. And then Monk was the consequence. So like you said with Tone, they didn't sit down and say, we will write 5+ seasons of Monk. Yeah, they were being paid for a concept called Monk. But what we have is only the evidence of what they did and discovered together that we don't know about because we weren't in the room with them. Mm-hmm. And so every single story and every single parable is a kind of invitation to open the door and forget about the parable, forget about the story you've seen, and find the people, find the tribe that will make you feel like those writers must have felt making that show up.
I think you really hit on something there, because that's what I love. I've never seen through to that before, but what I love about shows like that is that I feel like I'm part of that tribe, and it feels so good to be part of that tribe. But I'm not really part of that tribe. I'm part of the tribe that goes before that tribe, right? And maybe that's what Jordan Peterson's getting at in Maps of Meaning, is that all of these deep stories take us back to the very earliest of our people, and sitting around campfires and trying to figure out life and tell these stories and try to discern God's presence and God's will, and out of that come these ways of communicating. So
I see a deep affinity with what I take as your tone with that book, Maps of Meaning, in such a way that if you would have been next door to Peterson and lived the same years he lived, you would have written Maps of Meaning. Now, I mean that as a compliment, but I also mean to take focus off the fact that he authored that particular book. Instead, he is an example of a tribe of which the members of which I have discovered are at least two. One is Jordan B. Peterson, and the other is Karen Wong. And the book is a token or piece of evidence that such a tribe exists. Because you've mentioned it more than once, and you've even seen to the deep structure of what makes that book tick in terms of that final paragraph and the final sentence. Who else would have seen that but someone who would have made it? Who would have made it but someone who was already breathing the air of this tribe, and who knows how many members are in it and what they're doing right now, besides Peterson. It's a different way to look at tribes, different way to look at affinity groups.
It's a very different way of looking at tribes. I don't think I could breathe the same air he breathes. I don't know. Did you see his talk with Jonathan Pageau this week?
Parts. I saw it mediated through Paul Vandercliff.
Heartbreaking. So heartbreaking. And I'm not trying to draw too strong a parallel here, but just the verse that came to my mind is when Saul had his Damascus Road experience, and Christ says, I will show you how much you will have to suffer on my behalf. Because that's really what I feel, that in some way Jordan Peterson is like a prophet. He's making himself an offering. And it says, I think it's in Romans, that we are on the altar as living sacrifices. And I don't think he knows yet that's what he is, but he's really on the altar as a living sacrifice.
And notice how that breaking apart and possible reassemblage fits in with the movement of the book, Maps of Meaning. So it's a repetition, a new gradient of that same movement. And the fact that you were able to put your finger on that tells me something about what the movement is doing, not as an effect from his cause, but what the movement is doing in his role in it right now and your role in it. And in some way, Vanderklay and his use of the jump cut and the randos channel, like people, the way in which this genre is emerging is telling me something about, there's what people think they're doing, and then there's the fruits of what they've done, and then there's this orchard where these species tend to crop up. And then there are other orchards where there are different species. And then there's distance between the orchards. And I think we're getting to there. We're getting to that point where we could almost put it on a whiteboard and see it. Just like you and I saw the fulcrum as this way of talking about a lot of things that are happening simultaneously. It's almost as if philosophy has went full break story mode in a writer's room. It's this outsourced thinking aloud with multimedia. The difference between it and narrative, though, is narrative, you know you're telling a story that's a fable, a fantasy. You get to turn off the light switch at 5:00 p.m. and go home. With this, it's a little more dangerous because there isn't that clear line between fantasy and reality. And yet it partakes of all those complexities that a human being in a fantasy would find themselves with: moral dilemmas, confusing emotion with reason. Peterson even living it. Like, there was a moment when I heard he's in Russia in a coma. That sounds like something Dostoevsky would write about. Is this for real? And I found out he's really doing it. And I didn't know whether or not to be ambivalent towards him ever since. Is he doing this as a marketing strategy? No, he's really suffering. But that suffering is the perfect marketing strategy for his brand. What is going on? It's kayfabe, according to Eric Weinstein, where Hulk Hogan forgets Hulkamania is supposed to stay in the ring. It doesn't come with you home. You can't Hulk up and change a broken heart. But outside of that entertainment realm, the things Peterson's doing, like, I don't know where to put the wedge to separate fact and fiction. And it's new. It feels a little dangerous to me. Like, I'm glad I'm in the realm of narrative and I'm more comfortable in that writer's room, because
Paul did a 3-hour-long analysis of the first hour of the Jonathan Pageau thing, and I haven't gotten through Paul's whole thing. I did see the whole thing with Jonathan Pageau, and I saw his whole Jordan Peterson's talk with Tim Ferriss, which was also excellent. I saw the whole thing. I haven't seen Paul's whole thing, but the part I did watch of Paul's, he talked about Peterson living the ideal that he tells us we should strive to be. And at the same time that he's telling us that we should strive to be that, he also tells us what happens to the most ideal, who is Christ, and that is to be crucified. So if you live the life that he's calling you to, there's an obvious consequence, which he himself has not yet seen, I think. So there's that piece, but then if you take the other piece that is very prominent in Maps of Meaning, and that is the teaching about the shaman who goes through the dissolution of self. He goes out into the woods for, I don't know, 6 months and is completely destroyed physically, and then completely rebuilt physically after that. And that's what makes the shaman useful to the community. That's what gives the shaman insight into the needs of the community. Well, that at its most extreme is a picture of what any of us go through when we go through suffering, because we're going into that chiastic structure the point of suffering is that point of going through the narrowest possible place and then coming out into a broader realm where we have more insight, more vision, so to speak, because you can go through that suffering without Christ and still learn something. But when you come out the other side, if you've gone into it and come out the other side without Christ, without suffering along with Christ in the midst of it, you're going to bear fruit, but that fruit might be bitter fruit. It might be sweet fruit, but likely to be bitter fruit because you haven't been nourished and cared for when you've been in the midst of the suffering. Because when you're in the midst of the suffering, no human person can possibly know what you're experiencing. And that's what he's feeling right now. He's in the grip of suffering that he cannot articulate. And there's nobody who can understand where he's at. They could say, oh, I understand, I've had pain. No, every person's pain is completely unique to them. And his pain is unremitting. It's constant, day after day after day. No one can understand that except Christ. Christ knows exactly what he's going through. And he needs that friendship to walk with him. But he's afraid. He's afraid to reach out for that. And that's what, and it may be that he has to go through it alone in order to learn what he has to learn, so that when he does begin to walk with Christ, he has a deeper, richer experience from which to draw. I mean, I don't know. None of us can know what another person's path is supposed to look like.
Yeah, that's a great a writer could do well to heed what you said. That we cannot know the path of our characters.
You don't want to rescue someone out of their path, because that may be the path that has been designed for them for their ultimate good. So it's like Peterson always says, don't take away someone's agency by fixing things for them, right? But part of the agency is what you learn.
When you mention the chiastic structure, this is one of the pleasures of being in a room together and we're sharing these ideas for the story, presumably the story. We had worked on the fulcrum and we saw how that works with the positive and negative and how we could sub-break it down into the other characters. Well, when you brought up the chiasm, you drew it out. I noticed one of the things it is graphically is it's an upside down fulcrum, right? It says narrowing and then opening. The opening is the fulcrum underneath the bar, and the opening is above the bar, all that infinite white space. So a way to make a little more complex our abstract structure with the skeleton on the right and the skinned character on the left is they're moving left to right or going back for a little while, and we need to balance that out underneath. But above, as they're moving forward or back, they're either having this open or shut, depending on where they are, which gives us more resonance as we choose scenes and what happens in those scenes. Because now we can ask, where is the fulcrum? Where are they moving? And then how are they? Get all three of those. And we're combining your concept and we're combining tried and true recipe for conflict spectrum. And then we have a way to measure so we can always gauge where we are in a story long form at the bottom. And we're making it. And we have the anecdotes to drop on what's going on in real life.
You said a few minutes ago you thought it was terrifying that Peterson is living out the Russian novel, or that he's living out the shamanic ritual, which if you looked at it through Elon Musk's eyes, he would say, see, we are a simulation, right? Somebody's writing a script. So you've been on the inside of writing scripts. If you had a conversation with Elon Musk, is there anything you could say to him to convince him that we're not in a simulation?
Well, I don't think the simulation is defeatable because it's a catch-all word for, well, things turned out this way. They could have turned out another way. That's how I understand it. Like I could have, when I was 18 years old, on a summer trip laying tube for the state of South Dakota and getting paid for it, one day in the company car, I was almost in an accident. And it was by a hair's breadth turn right that I wasn't in a head-on collision. Well, what if I was? And what if I turned left instead of right immediately within that hair's breadth? I might not be here with you right now, or I might be still comatose. We don't know. And then that's just one example of how the whole universe could have been different. Multiply it by 31 years, 365 days of those 31 years. But where I would come at it from the writer's room is there are some things so powerful that they are remembering. That's level one. Like even as I was telling the story about the near head-on collision, I was getting bored with it as I spoke because it just didn't have enough oomph to me, even though it really happened. So there's a decision at what representations from the past I want to resimulate. That's a value. And it's kind of mysterious how those values emerge. But just because it's something I want to remember doesn't mean it's something other people want to remember or hear about or see again. But some of those things that are worth remembering are also worth sharing. Second value. And then there are things that are worth sharing that are worth preserving somehow, some way, no matter what. Come hell or high water, this thing, even if I have to go underwater, I'm going to put it in my right hand and put it over the surface on my tippy toes. And as it goes above my mouth, even though it's heavy and weighing me down, I've got to keep it up. I don't know if I found such a thing worth dying for, to be quite honest, because I love my life. David says, your love, O Lord, and loving kindness is better than life. It's worth remembering, it's worth sharing, and it's worth dying to keep it above the water, myself drowning. That proves to me it's not just a series of infinite replications of a simulation, that there are some things whispered from on high that make everything else irrelevant, really. And the writer, I think what separates the writers who do this their entire lives is they're on an obsessive hunt like a detective to find whatever that is and be devoted to it and worship it. And that's why it's so, I think that's the reason I've changed denominations so many times is I'm constantly battling, wanting to find that one thing and literally get on my knees and worship it because it's God, and knowing everything else except that thing is an idol and I would worship it. So I have to break ties with it radically, even though it's a good thing, because I haven't yet found the one. But I won't give up because I have heard it whispered and I do feel it at moments. And I try to tell stories that come closer to it and that bring me in a heart space so I'll take action to get even closer to it. Me taking this class was really about getting away from the solitude of writing to be in a room with other people to talk about things worth remembering and hear from their perspective what was worth remembering for them. Because I want to find God. I want to find the one.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about searching all the different denominations, but I think you've already found the one. And I think one of the purposes of church is that we have communion with other people who have also found the one, and we support each other in that. And so I'm a little bit radical, I guess, in that I don't think the denomination matters all that much. What matters is that whatever body you get into within that denomination, it needs to be a body of people who all understand that Jesus is the one, and that centers around that, and that has good, solid teaching about who he is. And I mean, that's super important. And you can find that within Protestantism, you can find that within Catholicism, you can find it within Orthodoxy.
I find it in watching
and
Peterson
I
sometimes.
wanted to
I
say
see it in
one-
Peterson.
Yeah, amongst the people who are following Jordan Peterson, there's a lot of that too. I wanted to say one thing about your little story about your near miss accident. It's all in how you tell the story. That could be a fabulous story. That could be an entire novel. It's just in how you tell the story. Because what were you thinking about at the moment that it happened? And was there something about what you were thinking about that caused you to move at just the right moment? And did something come out of that near miss that taught you something deep and powerful that changed your life from then on? I mean, there are a lot of things you could play with in that story that would make it a fascinating story.
Absolutely.
One
And
of the
so,
books that I read as a young woman that really impressed me was, I think it's called The Bridge at San Luis Rey. Did you ever read that?
nope.
It's it's about, I mean, what happened was, and I don't know if this is a true story or not, there was a bridge collapse and 5 people died in the bridge collapse. But the story is the backstory of those 5 people before the bridge collapse. And that's what makes it so powerful, is that you're inside the lives of all these people and you're made to care about them. So that at the moment the bridge collapses, there is a much deeper meaning to the collapse of that bridge than if you didn't know the entirety of those people's lives, right?
The payoff of that tragedy was hard won and fought for by, as you said, that structural decision to make the bridge collapse a bottleneck from this wide volume of the prequel, the life stories leading up to. And the audience knows what's coming, but they don't. And that's part of the pleasure of watching it. You want to almost put your hand through the screen or through the book. Stop, stop. This decision is going to lead to that decision, which is going to eventually lead you to the bridge. But they don't know.
But then, and I can't remember how the book ends, but I could see a potential for coming out of that bridge collapse. Maybe all sorts of things happen. Maybe all bridges everywhere are changed so that they never have the same problem that that bridge had. And so it saves countless millions of lives in the future. And maybe those people who died, their families start foundations to support different kinds of, it could be that many countless thousands of lives are affected by those 5 lives that were lost, which is kind of the way it works in history, right? One person is lost in some horrible tragedy and the family starts an organization that helps millions of people afterwards. You don't want to be the guy who's caught in the crosshairs.
One
But
of the things
that's because we look at our story as being finite just for this moment, and we don't see how our story intertwines with the entire story of the universe. Like Job.
Job.
I'm sure Job didn't want to be Job. And yet Job has given wisdom to so many people since then.
One of the things I hope to do in the future, in the long run, years to come, is be in a room where I could sit with people that are telling stories like you're telling and find the through line to connect them. And then just write it up there. And then they say, oh, and it pops in their mind, all these more associations. And then I can show them how that also connects. And so nothing is ever wasted or lost. Mm-hmm. And that would be my greater joy than actually sitting down and writing something, would be to show them how they contain the whole universe. They just needed someone to echo it from a different range. So when you were saying that, I noticed, it occurred to me earlier when I was saying that I was listening to the teacher for something that only I could have heard, and then it told me what to do next. And that's the way I work. That's my method. If we were in a room and we were telling this story and we were figuring out what the episodes with this character, when you said, oh, that story you told, it's all about the way you tell it, that made sense to me. I thought, okay, let me put that on a pin. Let's see what she does next with it. And then you focused on the car crash in and of itself. It was important to you for some reason, made me curious, pin 2. And then you brought up the bridge and a storytelling technique. That's 3 things. That immediately gave me the instinct of wanting to propose that could be our pilot, our first episode. Car crash, not a car crash. And then it's natural, it emerged from our conversation. We took a circuitous route that had nothing to do with the agenda of finding a pilot, a first episode. But in the course of our relating to one another, I said that thing, I wasn't very proud of it, but you brought it up to illustrate this larger issue. Well, I don't want that to go to waste. Let's bring that into our story. Make it the pilot somehow, and that narrows our focus so that even that decision is stamped with our personalities and what naturally emerged from our improv. So then I would propose that to you and see what you thought about it.
Yeah, well, what I pictured immediately is you're in the car, you're on the way. I don't know what the accident was, but I'll just make one up. You're going through the intersection and this gigantic semi is coming down, and you can see it's over. There's no hope. I'm not going to make it. And that's the first scene in the episode. And in that scene, your life starts to flash before your eyes, because that's what happens when people know they're going to die. And out of those flashes of the life flashing before the eyes, some of them expand out into, they're like little zip bombs. They expand out into backstory, and they keep expanding out into backstory and then when you wrap up the episode, you just miss this guy, and then you're moving on, and you stop you stop at headquarters, and they give you this task because something's coming up. And so then you're gonna, or maybe it would only be the first 10 minutes of the episode, and then you end up parking in front of the police station, and they tell you got to come because we've got this body.
I think there's something genius to what you just said. I don't think we should make it the teaser. I think your first instinct, I think, was right. Have the end of the pilot, the end of the 1 hour drama, be the missing. And so usually in pilots, you're supposed to tease what all the 100 episodes will be so that the audiences buy in. But what if we took the idea of a bottleneck? So you brought that up as a flesh on bones. I'm going to now challenge that to push you even further because I want more. I would say, okay, let me throw at that idea the requirement of a bottleneck. Now, a bottleneck in episodic television is we have our serialized form, we have all these threads that are being picked up episodes away, but a bottleneck comes out of nowhere, and it's a self-contained drama where you don't have to know what came before it or after. But if you know the plot threads, it makes that self-contained episode, usually where the characters are stuck in a room having a dialogue, all the more richer, all the more rich. Because then episodes later, you can remember, even though in the universe they're never bringing it up, in the bottleneck, he said. So that's now informing my understanding of his action now, even though the episode never says it and it wasn't a plot thread. That never starts at the beginning. So one of our ways to, like you said, your goal is to make a detective show that isn't predictable. One of the ways we can practically do that structurally, I would challenge your idea. What if we take what you just said on the strength of he misses it at the end? So the whole episode, even though it's 1 hour, is premised on the hair's breadth distance between the front of the semi and the front of the detective's car on the way to see the crime scene. He misses himself being a victim scene. We make that space the bottleneck. But we have to make it feel like a pilot at the same time.
Sounds like you're on a roll, but we got to stop now.
Yeah, but I just want to say that would set the tone for our show to be an ambitious one. And it would mean that if that's our bar set at the beginning, we would have to keep working at that level. And so it really is a commitment of personality and what you're willing to commit when people set up these shows together. So much is done at the very beginning that sets the tone. Okay.
Well, I mean, I hope this has been fun for you, and that when you do your writer's class, that it maybe enriches your experience.
I always learn something, Kate. I learned hundreds of things with you, Karen. You're great at improv, in my opinion. We can go both and together. I love doing that.
It really stretches me, because I like knowing where I'm going, and when I don't know where I'm going, it's scary. This has been great, Matt. I look forward to talking again. So maybe next time we should talk philosophy. It will be give me a chance to just rest, and I can listen to you.
Have a good day, Karen.
Bye-bye.